Started. Are we ready? Okay. Okay, welcome. Thanks for coming out. This session is establishing a foothold with JavaScript. So my name is Casey Smith. You can connect with me on Twitter at @subt. Recently joined Varus Group, Adaptive Threat Division, as a researcher. Really excited about that. Prior to that, I worked for a financial institution where I worked with both Red Team and Blue Team, which actually drove a lot of the research that we're looking at here today. So this is fun stuff. Hopefully, if you have questions, we may have to hold them till the end, but I'll be on the hallway afterwards if you have questions about how this stuff works. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to be talking about COM scriptlets, otherwise known as SCT files. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you used these or heard of these before? Okay, quite a few of you. Some of you haven't. I think this will be interesting to you. We'll also talk about a JavaScript rat. So just a very quick proof of concept that I put together to demonstrate in our environment how someone could, use JavaScript for command and control. We've actually got some examples of that being used in the wild, and we've seen an uptick in JavaScript for ransomware and other techniques. So we'll also talk about some defensive tactics that you can use to detect and deny this activity in your environment. So first of all, why are we even talking about JavaScript? Primarily because I was curious. And when we talk about living off the land, I just wanted to see, well, why not? Why couldn't we use JavaScript, or what could we use JavaScript for? And I stumbled onto this tool, Reg SVR32, and this JavaScript scriptlets, really just out of curiosity primarily. One of the questions that may come up is like, why JScript versus VBScript? So when we're talking about JavaScript here, we're really talking about JScript in the Windows scripting host. A lot of what you can do in VBScript, you can also do in JScript. There's some interesting ways to invoke JScript that I think will be, useful that you can't do with VBScript. So, but realize there's a lot of overlap with the two languages. So you can actually execute run DLL32, Reg SVR32, MSHTA. These are a couple of executables you can use to actually invoke directly JavaScript from the command line. Just a quick, if you're a defender, one of the things that's going to come up quite a bit is command line auditing. So we'll talk about how you can use some different tools to look for these events running in your environment. So when we talk about fileless, there's a lot of different interpretations for fileless. In this talk, we're really primarily focused on registry persistence. So what we've got is the ability to store a command or a subset of commands inside the registry. There's also fileless with WMI as another example. We're not going to talk about that in this class. There's been some great research Matt Graber's done on WMI and exposing some of and Jared as well. So we're not going to touch on that, but I'll primarily focus on the persistence as it relates to registry persistence. So, okay, COM scriptlets. So this was something that I found back in about April. And what this is COM objects that are backed by JavaScript files or XML files. And so what you have is an SCT extension that's, by default, that's associated with Notepad. So if somebody were to double click an SCT file, it would launch Notepad. However, there's some different ways you can invoke that we're going to take a look at. The extension doesn't actually matter. So what really matters is the content of the file. So for defenders, this gets very difficult because you could put a PNG or JPG extension on the file. It would still actually execute across a URL in your environment. So one of the questions that I had when I saw this was, how do we actually trigger execution on an SCT file? That's what we're going to talk about. I just added this slide here for reference. So this is about 9 different elements that could go into an SCT file. So you can create the COM scriptlet object. The ones that we're primarily interested in, though, are the script block and the registration block. There's other things that you can do here, and I would leave it for you to explore, but for now we're just going to talk about those 2 areas. So I published an example of a bare bones scriptlet back in April. I wanted to take you through what's interesting about this COM scriptlet. So there's about 15 lines of code here. To get this to execute your JScript on line 8, that could also be VBScript in this particular example. However, if you notice, there's a registration block on line 3. What I found is you can actually put code inside of the registration block that will execute when you call for register or unregister. So you can actually execute this without the COM scriptlet being registered on the host, which leaves no footprint in the registry, which is very interesting. So all we have to do is, inside of this registration tag, inside of the script block on line 11 there, put whatever code we want to execute, and that will be called when we call reg SVR32. So what does it look like from the command line? So again, from a command line auditing perspective, you would call reg SVR32/S, suppresses the warning prompts. So if there's an error that pops in your script, /u means we're going to call the uninstall portion of our function, unregister essentially this particular scriptlet, even though it wasn't even registered before. /I was basically, this is going to be the location of the COM scriptlet. So this can be a local file or it can be a URL. When I found this in the registry, I originally was just messing with local SET files, and I saw that in the registry it was like file : / / and I thought, well, I wonder if you just replace that with a URL. Sure enough, that works. This is an important, you can run this over HTTPS. It runs behind a proxy. It's very, very useful to get code to execute from inside of an organization. And then you pass scrobj.dll to the command. This is what actually runs the scriptlet. So that's essentially the scriptlet runtime. We'll talk about that in a moment. The thing that's important about that is when that command runs, it doesn't actually register the COM scriptlet. Okay, it doesn't leave an artifact in the registry at all because we didn't actually register the scriptlet. We call the unregister function. There's not a patch for that. That's the behavior of the scriptlet. So we'll talk about some defensive techniques. Again, command line auditing is a great one to detect this. Other techniques that we've looked at with WMI, sim sweep, some of those can detect some of those activities. So, okay, a bare bones scriptlet. So what this is would be the ability to execute or persist a scriptlet on a machine or host a more robust scriptlet. So inside of this example, we're going to look at, I created a basic scriptlet, I called it Bandit, and we're going to basically expose a method called exec. And so inside of here, we expose the public method, then we'll be able to call that function here, and it's defined further down inside of the script tag. So, you guys see me okay? I'm not blocking the screen, am I? We're good, okay. All right, okay. So, what's happening there, if you create these richer scriptlets, they're going to be invoked by the COM scriptlet runtime. It's sort of like a virtual machine, essentially, for scriptlet components. This is what actually does execute the scriptlet, and this is what would load into applications when you notice that a COM scriptlet actually executes. So if you call a scriptlet from, say, a .NET application or even PowerShell, this is the backing behind that COM scriptlet object. So if we were to create the scriptlet and register it, we could then invoke it in PowerShell, for example. So you could see here I've got a scriptlet. I create a new object, a COM object. We give it the name Bandit, and then we can pass the exec function, and this would call into and run the JavaScript that's backing that COM object. Does that make sense? Okay. If you wanted to evoke this through .NET, for example, if you wanted to have access to a JavaScript file, you have a .NET small footprint, you call out, this is using reflection. I'll just leave this in here for example. Again, we just called to the name of the scriptlet and then call the method we wanted to invoke. All right, this one here is really interesting because the scriptlet URL, I mentioned this already, but this can be a local file or it can be a remote file. And again, this is when you do actually register the COM scriptlet, this is the artifact that you would see. So generally speaking, you would not want to find in a registry sweep in scriptlet URL an actual URL. There's no reason really to be running remote scriptlets that I've seen. If you have a use case for that, please let me know. I haven't seen a use case for that yet. So this is the artifact you would find if you were looking for these inside the registry. Now this one's interesting that we've actually seen malware use this type of call to invoke some JavaScript. There's a little bit of a twist on here because I'm going to be calling a scriptlet in this situation. So the thing to point out on this slide is we call run DLL32. We're basically opening an HTA application. However, notice the URL that we're using here. We're using script:/HTTPS and then the path to wherever your scriptlet is hosted. That's what's going to trigger the execution of the COM scriptlet, and then we simply call the method that we defined in the scriptlet, and then we close the HTA file, so no message or warning would pop on the user's machine in that situation. So that's a distinction there as far as setting up the call with run DLL32. You can also invoke this via MSHTA, so you can pass the JavaScript URL or scheme essentially, and then invoke this via getObject. And getObject works very much like regsvr32. So it's proxy aware, runs over SSL, follows redirects. It's a great function. But again, we call the method and we're using the JavaScript scheme. So directly from the command line, if you see MSHTA called, run DLL32, those would be indicators that somebody may be executing a scriptlet in your environment. Are adversaries using this? They are. I don't know if yeah, here we go. Let me just show you this slide. So this is an example. Greg Foss did a presentation on this. We used to call this CB art, or carbon black art, essentially. So what you're looking at here is a process tree. So MSHTA executing PowerShell, executing regsvr32, and then iterating through multiple loops with regsvr32. So this is the kind of indicators that you would see for those of you who are working with tools that do command line auditing. Sysmon being a great example of that. Okay. So I wanted to see how far I could push COM scriptlets. What could you actually do with the JavaScript? So I created a scenario where I could have a scriptlet that had a DLL embedded inside of it that would download the DLL, decode the DLL, and then execute on disk. So there's a DLL that's on my GitHub page. It has all 5 different variations of whitelisting that are available. So it's got like install util, regsvr32, run DLL32. Basically, one of the things that you can do here is you can actually encode the file with cert util. So this is actually something I think Matt Graber and I found sort of independently, but very similar time frame, was that you could take a cert util, run this code. It doesn't have to be a certificate, actually. It can actually just encode any file. So to stage this, you run cert util, encodes the DLL, base64 into the script. You could add an encryption routine here if you wanted, and then anything that would be watching over the wire for that DLL would likely miss that because it wouldn't see that in the payload. And then to call that or invoke it, you would simply run regsvr32/s/u/i, the path, and then the strobjdll. This is what you would see inside of the file, inside of my proof of concept. Again, the reason I wrote this one was for blue teams to test. So if you wanted to go out and test and see if this would execute in your environment, that's exactly why this DLL exists. So let's look at a demo of that. It's pretty basic demo here. We're basically going to invoke regsvr32 on the command line. And then we're going to see that we'll drop 2 files to disk, one being the text file that's in the scriptlet, the second one then being the unpacked DLL, and then it would execute calc, just a very simple prototype. You could hide the prompt there so that doesn't pop up, but it takes a little while for it to decode. And then in the end there, you can see on disk, we left the 2 files, all the things as the base64 encoded file. Cert util decodes that to x64 DLL, and then executes calc. So there's quite a bit you can do with COM scriptlets besides just being limited to the JavaScript capabilities. All right. I mentioned this function briefly already, the get object. This works in Office macros as well as in HTA files or on the command line. You can also use, JavaScript or JScript to invoke WMI commands. So you could call the Win32 process create. Here's just an example of using get object to do that using the appropriate scheme to call into the WMI component. So in summary, we've got regsvr32 and get object. Those 2 commands coupled together are going to run these COM scriptlets for us. And I mentioned this already, but they support TLS, SSL. They can run through a proxy. They can follow redirects. Basically, as I started looking at this, it was built for C2. I started looking at more and saying, well, how could I then take this and use this for command and control? And that led me to write a very, very rudimentary JavaScript rat, which we'll talk about in a minute. One important note here is you can even get the scriptlet files to execute if the Windows script host has been disabled. So what you see on this screen here is actually, I double-clicked on a JS file to just trigger the fact that there is a script host blocking is enabled. It's a registry entry you can make that I've got referenced here on the slide. So that's the pop-up showing, hey, you can't run just an arbitrary script, but then in the background you can see I can run an regsvr32 and it still runs the script even though script hosting has been denied. So it doesn't actually pop the box on the regsvr32 command. Okay, and we talked about this being backed by registry only. So again, you could actually, if you have access to the machine, you created just the necessary registry keys pointing to that URL, then however you choose to persist that execution command, you'd be able to call and run that scriptlet. Metasploit now has a module that will host an SCT file for you. So a shout out to Trenton. He did the work on this to get this module put into Metasploit. So this is great to see. Has anybody used this yet? Anybody just curious to show of hands? Anybody's, okay. So something to be aware of that's available. Okay. So a JS rat. very crappy PowerShell server. If you look at the code, it's on GitHub. I released it. It's actually released now. I made the repo public this morning. So it was really proof of concept, and I want you guys to give me feedback. It's something that I think it's helpful on assessment to maybe run and see if it's detected. That's really the point of this. It's really not full-blown C2 yet. It's really just like a target practice almost, okay? So inside of the scriptlet, we simply call getObject back to a variable that's in the PowerShell script hosted, and we just call task.sct. Again, that's configurable. You could name that file whatever you wanted. When that loops through on the endpoint, what we then do is we run the command, or the, here we're just going to run 3 different commands. So we're going to run a command, hostname, ipconfig, who am I? So we want to just get that information off of the box. In order to then eliminate some of the complex proxy checking and variables that I would have had to do, I decided to continue to use getObject to send request a non-existent URL, and that's essentially like posting the data back to the server, okay? So what this is doing on line 12 is simply calling back with the results of the base64 encoded output of those 3 commands. It can split those into multiple blocks and then reassemble them on the server and then output them for C2. So let's look at a sample demo of that real quick. So I use Fiddler quite a bit. If you haven't used Fiddler, it's a great tool to do web debugging, SSL decryption. But essentially, I use the Fiddler to be my simulated proxy. So here I've got the JSRAT listening on port 80. And then we're going to invoke regsvr32, call into it, pops calc, writes back the data back to the server. And you can see as far as the method that's used, you can see we're using a GET request instead of trying to post it back. You could extend this if you wanted to in your environment. So questions on that? Does that make sense? So just a really quick basic proof of concept on being able to run that. All right. Okay, so something else that came up as I was working with scriptlets was, how could you run shellcode, or what are some capabilities that JScript has to be able to execute shellcode? There's this amazing COM DLL, essentially called Dynamic Wrapper X. It's both in English and Russian, so run this in test environments only. I haven't debugged or reverse engineered this completely, so but what this allows you to do is to make Win32 API calls directly from, say, VBScript or JScript. So you do have to install that. It does persist on disk, but it gives your scripting capabilities quite a step up. So we have actually seen, at least one analyst reported this, has seen this being used in the wild. So be aware of the DLLs on the GitHub page. You can also see, you can download it from that URL as well. This one is x86 only. There's a newer version out that does x64 and x86 as well. What it would look like then in your JScript, if you install this DLL, would be simply create the ActiveX object dynamic wrapper X here, and then map your function. So here I'm just showing you can map virtual alloc, for example, and then you can map your shellcode into memory and then make a call. Very, very basic. Just sort of working the details out. I've posted the proof of concept on my GitHub page so you can work through how to map those function calls. So one of the questions that may come up is, what are some of the defenses against COM scriptlets? How do we detect this in our environment? What are some other mechanisms that we can use? One of the defenses that came out was actually published shortly after the research on regsvr32, and this is on the GitHub repo as far as using emit. Is anybody using emit? Just a quick show of hands. Okay, so several of you are using emit. So what this is, it actually is the attack surface reduction component, and so it prevents regsvr32 from loading SCR OBJ DLL and SCR run DLL. So that's one of the mitigations that you can deploy to prevent that type of attack. Another defense that's coming out with Windows 10 Enterprise, I think it's also in education, I heard today, is that you can block unapproved scripts. And so the script host is, Microsoft will use the term enlightened or aware, or essentially it's checking to make sure that that scriptlet is signed or is approved in your environment. So here you can see when you block or you execute JS, and by default, device guard is going to prevent that. So despite a lot of the research that I publish, I do actually believe whitelisting is a very valid defense. There are, of course, bypasses, but it's been one of the most effective things that we did as an organization to stop a number of different types of attacks. So device guard is very strong. I encourage you to take a look at it. Start looking at that inside of your environment. So I think we're doing okay on time here. Let's see. Yep, I think we're doing good. That's what I've got. So hopefully this is helpful. I want to give you guys a chance if you have questions. Again, out on the GitHub repo are all the sample code that I showed, as well as connect with me on Twitter, feedback on the prezo or talk or anything afterwards. So thank you for your time. Any questions before a couple question here on the front row? Yes.
What legitimate uses of SCTs, like file-back ones, have you seen? Because you said you hadn't seen the URL-based ones.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody using COM scriptlets. Actually, I haven't seen. It's a good. So the question was just for the question was, what legitimate use have you seen of SCTs? I haven't seen anybody use. It's an old technology. It's been around for quite some time, and I haven't seen any. I haven't talked to anybody yet that says, oh well, we can't block that because we use SCT files. I haven't come across that yet. So. Good question. Question here?
One thing we did in Carbon Black was look for netcons on Reg server and everything else, so that's a good rule.
Okay. Something you can use if you're checking for network connections, look for Reg SVR32 making netcons. So good. Other questions? Yes, question back here.
Real quick, you mentioned that it didn't matter what file extensions was attached to it. Can you go a little more in depth on that?
Sure.
How you can use that?
Sure. So the question was, I mentioned that the file extension does not actually matter. And so what actually matters is just that it conforms to the XML for the scriptlet file. And so that's defined back on one of the earlier slides. I had the reference with the 8 or 9 elements in there. As long as it's well-defined XML, it can be any file extension as far as calling it from a URL. So you might put a JS extension or a JPEG so that over the wire it might look like, if somebody's just looking at URL monitoring, it would look like they just downloaded a photo. But if you actually crack that open and look at the contents, you'd see that it's still that well-formed XML. Does that answer the question? Okay, great. Yes. The question was would the MIME type matter? And I haven't experimented with that, so I'm not sure. I don't think that it would, but I haven't honestly tested it, so I don't know. Good question. Yes. So the question was, is it possible to use named pipes instead of URLs? I don't know. I haven't experimented with that either. So that'd be something. If you Windows shares, again, I honestly haven't put in a UNC path. I don't see why it wouldn't work, but I haven't tested it. Good question. Yep. Certainly a map drive would work. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, what privileges do MSHTA and Reg SVR32 run under default? They run as the normal user account. Yep, so there's no privilege escalation in these examples here. It's just that whatever access the user that executed the command you'd get that access. Yes, question?
So you mentioned all the command line interfaces into it, like Reg SVR32 and like MSHTA. Have you done much experimentation using the ActiveScript event consumer with permanent WMI event subscriptions?
I have not. The question was, have I done much with ActiveX WMI subscriptions? I have not. Yep. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. If you have other questions, we're going to talk in the hall. Thank you.